They gave me the crate on a Tuesday. That's not the detail you'd expect me to lead with, but when I try to put this in order, and I've tried, more than once, because the debriefing officers kept asking, and the garrison council kept sending forms. Tuesday is where it starts. Not with the canyon. Not with the queen. Not even with the sound the cub made when I first opened the latch on that cage. The sound I still hear sometimes when the wind comes off the plateau at the right angle. Tuesday. A crate. A set of transfer papers that Commander Serath Cian signed with the particular flourish of a man who has already decided he won't be seeing you again. I'd been at Garrison Orvith 9 for 3 months by then. That's not its proper designation. The proper designation is something in high territorial registry that takes 4 syllables and means nothing to a frontier grunt. But the garrison is built on the Orvith escarpment, is how it got the name. And I was its liaison escort, which is a job title that also means nothing. They invented the position when they couldn't court-martial me. For what I said to Colonel Dreveth at the Sector 12 review board, couldn't promote me out of range, and couldn't quite bring themselves to post me somewhere actively hostile, because they didn't want the paperwork, if I died. So they parked me at a frontier outpost on the edge of the Duskreach Barrens and told me to liaise. Whom, or what was left artfully unspecified. For 3 months, I'd been maintaining gear, reviewing maps, eating garrison food, watching Commander Vian run what he called a territorial calibration initiative, and what the Velhari, if they had a term for it, probably called a provocation. He'd been running survey teams into the buffer zone, planting monitoring equipment in the rock formations along the plateau rim, making careful, documented incursions that were each, individually, defensible under the boundary protocols, and which, collectively, amounted to the slow, polite invasion of a species whose concept of territory was older than our written language. The Velhari had not responded militarily. They'd pulled back, contracted their visible range, stopped appearing on the ridgelines where they'd been spotted regularly for the previous 2 decades of intermittent contact. Vian called this a successful recalibration. The 3 Velhari cultural advisors on the station, small, careful people who had spent careers studying the species from a very safe distance, called it something more worrying in tones they used when they thought Vihan couldn't hear them. The word they used, as near as I could translate it from their own technical vocabulary, was brooding. Then, the survey team from Sector 7 came back with a cub in a crate. I wasn't there for the capture. I wasn't told about the capture. I heard about it the way you hear about most things at garrison outposts, which is through the mess hall conversation of people who assume a liaison escort is essentially furniture. The team had found the cub in a rock shelter, separated from whatever group it had been with. The team leader, a junior surveyor named Orath, had decided it was abandoned. He had not asked the cultural advisors. He had not asked anyone with a background in territorial species or predator biology. He had looked at a cub the size of a large dog, alone in a rock shelter, and made the reasonable frontier decision that an orphan was a scientific opportunity. The cultural advisors, when they found out 48 hours later, went very quiet in a way that was much louder than shouting. Commander Vian, to his credit, understood within about an hour of that conversations that something had gone badly wrong. The cub was not an orphan. The rock shelter was a nursery cache. Velhari mothers left cubs in sheltered positions while they ranged during the dawn hunt, turning within hours. The cub had been in that shelter for probably 90 minutes before Orath's team found it. It had been in the garrison crate for 2 days by the time anyone with relevant expertise knew it existed. And in those 2 days, 3 things had happened that Vian was still trying to quantify when he handed me the transfer papers. The first was that the cub had stopped eating. The second was that the Velhari scouts that had been maintaining their cautious, invisible distance from garrison activity had moved, not toward the garrison. They had moved to form a loose, unbroken ring around the escarpment at a distance of approximately 8 kilometers. There were 17 of them that the surveillance equipment could locate. The advisor said there were probably more that it couldn't. The third was a sound. The cultural advisors had recordings of it from the plateau microphones. A very low, very steady pulse, subsonic at the edges, that had started on the evening of the first day and had not stopped. They played it for me in the briefing room, and I felt it in my teeth before I heard it with my ears. They told me it was a category of Velhari vocalization they had only documented 3 times. 40 years of contact. They used careful, measured language to describe it. The closest translation they could offer was the word. That means what a mother does when she's is calling something home that has not come home yet. Shh. And she has been calling long enough that the sound has stopped being a call and become a condition. Vian explained that the cub needed to be returned. He explained it with the tone of a man delivering a military necessity, which is what he had made himself believe it was. He had documentation. He had a protocol. He had what he called a goodwill gesture, the kind of phrase that means whatever you need it to mean. The cub would be transported across the Duskreach Barrens to the edge of Velhari territorial boundary. Contact would be made, and the animal transferred to its people. He explained all of this to me, in particular, because I was the liaison escort, because that was technically what the job existed to do, and because, though he didn't say this part, didn't need to. 3 days crossing the Barrens on foot with a frightened Velhari cub, and arriving at the territorial boundary of a species, currently sitting 17 plus, deep in a ring around the escarpment. Making a sound like grief was an assignment he did not want to give to anyone. He would miss. I signed the transfer papers. I signed them because the cultural advisors, Fiend, in the 3 minutes Vin had allowed them to speak during the briefing, had said 2 things that stayed with me. The first was that Velhari cubs imprint on the scent and movement patterns of individuals, not on species, that the cub, having spent 2 days in a crate in a garrison, had imprinted on whatever it could reach, which was primarily the hand of the mess cook, who had been trying to get it to eat, and the sounds and rhythms of military routine. The second was that the return transit mattered. Not just the destination, not just the handoff. The cub needed to arrive with something that felt, to the Velhari scouts who would certainly be watching the entire crossing, like care. I was, in the advisor's careful phrasing, the individual at the garrison most likely to provide that. They didn't elaborate. I didn't ask them to. I took the crate. I packed for 4 days. I left at first light on Tuesday. The crate was roughly 1 meter by half a meter, standard survey team containment, ventilation panels on 2 sides, and a latch that required a deliberate 2-hand motion to open. The cub inside weighed, I estimated from lifting it, somewhere between 18 and 22 kilograms. It had been silent for most of the 2 days since the advisor's discovery of it, which they said was worse than noise. And as I carried it down the escarpment switchbacks in the pre-dawn gray, it stayed silent, though I could feel it shifting with my steps. I waited until I was out of sight of the garrison before I set the crate down and sat next to it in the gravel and said hello. Not in Velhari. I don't speak Velhari. Nobody at the garrison did, despite the advisor's best efforts, in any practical sense. I said hello in the same voice I'd use talking to a scared private in a new posting, which is to say quietly and without inflections, and without expecting an answer. I told it we had a few days ahead of us. I told it the ground was going to be rough, and the air was going to be cold at night, and that I had water and food, and that I was going to figure out how to get them through the ventilation panels in a way that worked for both of us. The cub made a sound, not the sound the advisors had played me. Nothing like that. This was smaller. A catch and release of breath through what I assumed was a throat built very differently from mine. A short, stuttered rasp that ended in a higher frequency I felt in my molars more than heard with my ears. It was, I decided, the sound of something that had been silent for 2 days choosing, in a small and provisional way, not to be silent anymore. I sat there for another few minutes. Then I picked up the crate and started walking. The Duskreach Barrens stretch for roughly 260 kilometers between the garrison escarpment and the Velhari territorial boundary at the canyon formation called the Throat. Not all of it is what you'd classically call barrens. There are sections of amber scrub and dry creek beds, and wind-sculpted rock formations that have a specific stark beauty I'd noticed on the maps and found more striking in person. The plateau sits at elevation, which means thin air and cold nights, and a quality of light during the middle of the day that's simultaneously very clear and very harsh, the kind of light that makes distances deceptive. I'd crossed similar terrain on Sector 4 posting, years back, and I trusted my legs on it. I'd been allocated a ground vehicle. I declined the vehicle because the advisors had said, in the careful way, they said things they thought Vian wouldn't understand, that the sound of mechanized movement in the Barrens would signal the wrong kind of intent to the scouts that would certainly be paralleling my route from the moment I left the escarpment. On foot carrying was a different message. I wasn't sure I fully understood the semiotics of it. I trusted the advisors read of it more than I trusted Vian's logistics, and so I walked. By mid-morning, the crate was getting awkward, heavy. The cub's weight was manageable, but the geometry of a rigid rectangular box does not lend itself to extended carry over uneven ground. I stopped in the shade of a rock formation to shift my grip and drink some water, and the cub made the rasping high note sound again, twice, and then pressed its nose against the ventilation panel nearest my hand. I let it sniff my fingers. It took a while, pressed hard enough that I could feel the detail of its nostrils against the ventilation mesh. Wet and warm and systematic, moving from finger to finger in a very deliberate way, as if cataloging rather than simply investigating. I held still. After a few minutes it made a different sound, lower and more continuous, and I felt the vibration of it through the crate panel. Not quite a purr, not the purring of an earth animal, but in the same family of intention, a sound that means the body has decided, for now, that the thing it is near is not a threat. I gave it some of the food the advisors had packed, strips of something protein-dense and dark that had come from the garrison cold stores, apparently identified as approximating the cub's natural diet it ate. Slowly, pauses between each piece, as if waiting to confirm the previous one had been acceptable. But it ate. I kept walking. By late afternoon of the first day, I'd covered about 60 kilometers. The crate had developed a rhythm with my walking. I'd found a way to hold it, against my left side, with my left arm braced under the base, and my right hand steadying the top, which was inefficient but kept the ventilation panels clear and let the cub orient itself against my hip. I was talking to it by then, continuously. In the way you talk when you're covering ground alone and the quiet gets too specific, noting landmarks, commenting on the quality of the rock, mentioning that the amber scrub was interesting up close, in a way the maps hadn't suggested. The cub didn't respond to most of it, but, at one point, I something about the color of the light on the western ridge, and it made the catalog, sniff sound again, as if trying to identify what I meant by the observation. I camped in a shallow rock bowl about 70 kilometers out, which gave me windbreak and a clear sightline in 3 directions. Standard positioning from Sector 4 training, applied without much thought. I built a small fire. The altitude made it cold enough to need. I'd been sitting with the crate beside me for about 20 minutes, fire going, eating from my own rations when I made the decision. The advisors had not told me to open the crate. They had not told me not to. The crate was containment for transit. That was its purpose, and it had a functional latch. And there was a reasonable argument for keeping the animal contained for the duration of the crossing. It was also a cub that had spent 2.5 days in a box slightly larger than itself, in a garrison full of unfamiliar smells and sounds. That was by any read I could make of it, frightened and stressed, and increasingly choosing to orient toward me, rather than away from me. I did the 2-hand latch motion and opened the door. The cub didn't come out immediately. It sat in the opening for a long time, looking at the fire, looking at me, looking at the dark beyond the rock bowl's rim. I didn't do anything. I sat still and ate my rations and let it do its assessment. Eventually it came out. It walked in a very precise circle around the perimeter of the camp, low and careful, nose working. It investigated the pack. It investigated my boots. It circled back to the crate and went in and came out again. Then it walked over to me, stood very close to my left leg for a moment, and sat down. Not on me, beside me, about 8 centimeters from my knee, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it through my trousers. Close enough that when I exhaled, slowly, it oriented its head toward the sound. Didn't move suddenly. I didn't reach for it. I finished my rations and banked the fire and said goodnight to something that didn't understand the words but seemed to understand the cadence of the sentence, and lay down on my sleeping pad. The cub spent another 20 minutes exploring the perimeter of the camp. Then it came back, walked twice around my sleeping pad, and settled itself against the left side of my ribs. I lay there for a while listening to it breathe. The weight of it was specific and warm. When it exhaled, it made the low continuous sound, not the catalog sniff, not the rasping high note, but the other one, the one I'd felt through the crate panel. I lay still and let it happen. Above the rock bowl, the stars of the Dusk Reach Plateau were very clear. Cold stars. Far ones. I'd seen them from Garrison, but from the ground they were different. Closer in the way things get closer when you've removed the walls between yourself and them. I slept. Day 2 started early because the cub started early. It was moving against my ribs before the sky had shifted from black to gray. A small systematic pressure that was not aggressive but was not negotiable, and I took it as instruction and got up. We ate. I gave it more protein strips and drank my water and looked at the maps. Roughly 60 kilometers to cover to reach the Day 2 camp position I'd planned. The terrain would get rougher in the middle section. A series of dry creek beds and eroded formations where the footing was unreliable. The cub had decided by morning that the crate was optional. It followed me when I packed up. It stayed within about 3 meters, quartering back and forth across my path as I walked, and if I got ahead of that distance it made the rasping high note sound and moved to close the Ququos gap. Not anxious, not the frantic closing distance of an animal that has lost its anchor, more deliberate. More like a choice it had made about spacing, and was enforcing. By mid-morning it was walking in my shadow. I mean that literally. The light was high and harsh, and the shadow I threw was long and dark on the pale ground, and the cub had worked out, apparently, that walking in the shadow was cooler than walking beside it. So it walked perhaps a half step behind my left heel, in the shadow, and I adjusted my pace to keep it comfortable. We probably looked to whatever surveillance equipment or biological scouts were watching from the ridgelines, like something neither of us had entirely intended to become. I didn't examine that thought too closely. I just walked. The difficult terrain in the middle section was as awkward as the maps had suggested. There were 3 creek beds that required careful footwork, loose shale and eroded edges, and drops of 2 to 3 meters into dry channels that would take an ankle if you weren't paying attention. I crossed them slowly, checking footing before committing weight. The cub crossed them differently. It would move ahead at the edge, assess the situation with what looked like brief, intense calculation, and then cross in 2 bounds that covered the distance I was spending 3 minutes negotiating. Then it would wait on the far side and make the rasp and high note sound until I caught up. The second time it did this, I said, out loud, that I was aware I was slow and would appreciate the patience. The cub chirped. That's the only word I have for it. A short, mid-range vocal that felt, in context, like acknowledgement. Not agreement, not reassurance. Just receive. I said, out loud, that it was very decent of it to be patient with me. It chirped again. I let myself smile a little. Which is something I mostly stopped doing around the 3rd month of garrison duty. I kept walking. Somewhere in the early afternoon of Day 2, I became aware that we were not alone on the plateau in any casual sense. I'd known, in the abstract, that the Velhari scouts would be tracking us. The cultural advisors had made that clear, and my own read of the pattern of retreats and silence around the garrison supported it. But the knowing in the abstract is different from the specific, physical awareness of being watched. It wasn't anything I could have articulated as evidence. No shapes on the ridgelines, no sounds that my ears could separate from wind and rock and the dry scrape of my boots. Just a quality of attention in the environment. A particular stillness in certain directions. A way the ambient noise of the plateau organized itself that didn't quite match what the wind alone would explain. 20 years of frontier posting gives you a kind of peripheral sense for it. Not precise enough to report, but reliable enough to trust. We were being watched. By something that had decided so far that watching was sufficient. The cub seemed to know, not alarmed. It had not reacted to whatever its own more acute senses were telling it. But it was walking closer, occasionally pressing against my left calf, and twice it stopped walking entirely, and sat in my shadow, and looked at something on the north ridge, line for a count of about 30 seconds before getting up and continuing. The second time it did that I stopped too, and looked at the same place on the ridgeline, and said quietly that I was bringing it home, and that I was aware we were being supervised, and that I didn't have any objection to being supervised. I was speaking into the middle distance, in the general direction of whatever was on the ridge, is a statement about the degree to which the situation had modified my behavior from baseline. The stillness on the ridge held for a moment. Then it wasn't there anymore. Not a visible departure, just a quality of absence where there had been a quality of presence. The cub pressed against my calf once, briefly, and then went back to walking in my shadow. We made camp that evening at the day 2 position, another rock formation, better windbreak than the previous night. The cub had learned the camp routine by then. It circled the perimeter, investigated everything, made its assessment, and settled. But its settling point had moved. It was no longer beside my ribs. It climbed onto my sleeping pad before I was on it, arranged itself in the center with a precision that clearly allocated no space for me, looked at me with pale ice eyes, till I sat on the edge of it and accepted the negotiated settlement of approximately 30% of the pad's surface. I ate my rations. It ate its protein strips. I told it about the third day's route. The terrain would ease. The last 40 kilometers before the canyon were relatively flat with good footing, and the throat itself was a geological formation that by all accounts was worth seeing. The cub ate and looked at me and made the low continuous sound, and I felt it in my ribs from outside. I lay down on the 30% I'd been allocated. The cub rearranged itself until it was in contact with my left arm from shoulder to elbow. The warmth of the scales. They had an unusual quality of retaining heat. The amber bronze ones along its back especially, was specific and significant in the cold. Above us the same cold stars. I thought about Commander Veen. About the way he'd delivered the assignment, the particular texture of his courtesy, which was the courtesy of a man handing you something he expects you not to survive. About the garrison advisor's careful phrasing. About the crate, was somewhere 5 meters behind me, empty and latched, which I hadn't thought about since I'd opened it. I thought about the sound the plateau microphones had recorded. The sound they'd called a condition rather than a call. I thought about what it would mean to be the thing that could make that sound stop. The cub made a sound in its sleep. Short, almost like a word. I told it we had 2 more days and it was going to be fine. And I meant it in the way you mean things when you say them quietly into the dark and they become true because you've said them. Third day was easier in the body and harder in other ways. The terrain flattened, as I'd told the cub it would. Good footing. Pale ground and amber scrub in a sky that stayed clear and hard blue all the way to the western horizon. We moved faster. The cub had worked out by then that it could ride my left shoulder for sections of terrain where the ground was monotonous and the pace was steady, and it had worked this out not by asking, but by climbing up my pack straps when I was stationary and arranging itself across my shoulders before I started moving again. It weighed 20 kilograms of scaled feline on my shoulders and neck, and was warm and present and entirely calm about it. I walked with 20 kilograms of scaled feline on my shoulders and neck, and did not comment on the situation except to note, once, that this was probably outside the scope of what liaison escort paperwork anticipated. The cub chirped from approximately 6 centimeters above my right ear. By midday I could see the canyon. The throat in the maps is a notation and a set of coordinates. On the ground, it is something else. The plateau drops away in a long escarpment to the east, and the canyon cuts into that escarpment in a formation that from a distance looks like a wound and from closer looks like something built, not by hands but by time and water and the specific patience of geology. The walls are dark red and amber and the color of old bone, and they catch the light at midday and return it in a way that makes the whole formation seem briefly luminous. The Velhari Den complex is cut into the canyon walls. I knew this from the maps and from the advisor's briefings. Knowing it and seeing the scale of it are different things. The den openings are large enough for adult Velhari, which means large enough for something considerably bigger than me. And they go deep, and from the plateau rim you can see the wear patterns of generations of use on the rock at each entrance. The smooth worn stone. That happens when the same bocce makes the same passage thousands of times over decades. I stood at the plateau rim and looked at it for a while. The cub had climbed down from my shoulders when we stopped. It was sitting beside my left foot, looking at the canyon, and its posture was something I hadn't seen in the previous 2 days. A particular stillness that wasn't the calm stillness of a sleeping pad or a camp perimeter check. Something recognizing, something resolving. It made a sound I hadn't heard before. Not the rasp and high note, not the chirp, not the low continuous warmth. This was a threat descending call, pitched low, that it threw off the plateau rim toward the canyon below, and the sound traveled, and the canyon walls caught it, and the echo came back changed by the rock, longer and deeper. From the canyon something answered. Not an echo, an answer. The sound that came back up from the canyon was the sound from the plateau microphone, recordings, the subsonic one, the one I'd felt in my teeth before my ears caught it. Except on the recordings, it had been filtered through equipment and distance, and the acoustics of a garrison briefing room, and here it came up from the canyon walls in full, and I understood for the first time that the word the advisors had used, condition rather than call, was precise and literal. This was not a communication. It was a state. It was the sound a body makes when part of it has been absent and is no longer absent, and the sound doesn't stop because the relief is too large to contain in a call. In a single vocalization, in anything smaller than a continuous emission of the entire frequency range the body can produce. The cub pressed against my left calf. Hard. Frightened. The opposite. It was trembling, but not the way things tremble when they're scared. Shh. The way things tremble when they've been holding something very tightly for a long time. And the thing they were holding is coming back. I sat down on the plateau rim and waited. They came up from the canyon in stages. First ones were the scouts. I recognized the quality of their movement even before I could see them clearly. The same deliberate efficiency I'd been feeling on the ridgeline since day 2, now made visible. 8 of them. Full adult Velhari, not cubs. The amber bronze scales of maturity. Each one moving with the low center of gravity gait of an animal that has evolved to cross this kind of terrain, faster than anything else alive on it. They spread out along the canyon rim in a loose half-circle with me at the center, perhaps 30 meters out, and stopped. They looked at me. All of them. I looked back. The cub was pressed against my left knee, vibrating with that sustained, held breath, trembling, making the 3-note call on a loop now, sending it down the canyon and waiting for the return. For a moment I said, out loud to no one and everyone, that I had brought the cub back. I said it in standard because I don't speak Velhari. I said it quietly, without inflection, without gesture. The scouts didn't react to the sound of it. Velhari don't process standard the way we do, but I said it anyway. The way you say things that need to be said regardless of the immediate audience. Then the Queen came up. I'd been given a briefing on Queen-class Velhari. Photographs, measurements, the advisor's clinical descriptions of size differential and main morphology and behavioral indicators. I thought a working picture. The working picture was inadequate. She came up the canyon path at a pace that was not hurrying, not the rushing of reunion, though it was clearly that. But the pace of something that moves at whatever speed it has decided to move at. And the pace it had decided was enough to arrive in a very short time, while still maintaining the posture of something that moves at its own. She was twice the size of the largest scout. The quills of her mane were dark, almost black, and they stood out from her neck and shoulders in a way that added another 30% to her apparent mass and did not seem to be about temperature regulation. Her scales were older than the scouts, not duller, but deeper, the amber bronze layered and rich, the color of something that has been accumulating meaning for a long time. She stopped 12 meters from me. The cub launched itself. I mean that precisely. Not walked, not ran, launched. A single explosive bound from my knee across the intervening ground, and the Queen dropped her head to meet it. And for a moment the two of them were a single entity, the cub's 20 kilograms absorbed into the Queen's mass, with a completeness that suggested the word reunion was technically insufficient. The sounds they made were not in any register I can describe in standard. The scouts on the canyon rim lowered their heads simultaneously, a single motion, not coordinated by any signal I could observe. I stayed where I was, sitting on the plateau rim with my hands on my knees, and watched. It lasted several minutes. Then the cub did something I had not anticipated. It pulled free of the Queen. Not completely. It stayed in contact with her. one forepaw on her shoulder, but it turned, and it looked at me, and it walked back to where I was sitting. It walked back across 12 meters of open ground, past the Queen, past the scouts who had lowered their heads, and it sat down at my left foot, and it made the chirp sound once, and looked up at me, looked down at it for a moment. Then I looked up at the Queen. The Queen was looking at me. I had been looked at by Velhari before, in recordings, in the advisor's briefings, in the distant sighting reports that occasionally came in from the Barrens. Looking at a Velhari in a photograph is a specific experience. Looking at a Queen-class Velhari across 12 meters of plateau rim, while her cub sits at your foot and the canyon carries her subsonic voice at the edge of your hearing, is a different experience in ways that I am not certain I have the vocabulary to fully specify. She was not assessing a threat. I understood that immediately, with the same peripheral sense certainty I'd had about being watched on the ridge lines. It had the same quality of beyond evidence, too direct and too specific to be wrong. She was assessing something else. She was looking at me the way the cub had looked at the first ventilation panel, systematic, thorough cataloging. She stepped forward, 3 steps, closed the distance to 9 meters. The scouts on the canyon rim hadn't moved. I didn't move either. I sat on the rim with my hands on my knees and the cub at my left foot, and looked back at the Queen at 9 meters, and didn't say anything. There was nothing appropriate to say. There was nothing that needed saying. The cub had made its statement, and the Queen was reading it, and all I had to do was hold still and be readable. After a time, I couldn't have said how long, the Queen did something I would later spend considerable effort trying to describe accurately in debriefing reports, and considerable further effort trying to get the debriefing officers to understand the significance of. She lowered her head. Not a bow, in the ceremonial sense. Not submission in the predator hierarchy sense. The advisors, when I described it to them afterward, used a term in their technical vocabulary that translated, most approximately, as the recognition offered between 2 things that have each established, to the other's satisfaction, that they are what they are. She lowered her head to me, on the plateau rim. In the way you would lower your head to something you have decided is worth the gesture. Then she lifted it and turned, and she and the cub went down into the canyon together. The scouts watched me for another few minutes. Then they went down too, one at a time without urgency, as if departing a routine patrol. The last one paused at the canyon edge and looked back at me for a long moment before going over. I sat on the plateau rim for a while after they were gone. The sun had moved through a significant portion of the sky during the time I had been sitting there, which surprised me when I noticed it. I ate the last of my rations. I drank some water. I looked at the canyon, which was silent now except for the wind, and at the den openings in the walls, and at the wear on the rock at each entrance. Should have started back. 3 days to the garrison, and I'd used my supplies well but not extravagantly. I had what I needed. I didn't start back immediately. I sat there a while longer, not thinking about anything in particular, present, with the canyon and the light and the feeling of the stone under me, and then I packed up and stood up and started the walk back. First 2 days of the return were quiet. Good weather. The terrain that had been difficult going out was easier going back. In the way familiar difficulty is always easier the second time. I walked steadily. I didn't talk to anyone because there was no one to talk to, and the silence was a different kind from the silence on the way out. Less empty, less like something waiting. On the 3rd day, about 40 kilometers from the garrison escarpment, I became aware again that I was not alone on the plateau. It was going to say it was the same quality of attention from the ridge lines, the same peripheral sense awareness of being watched. But it wasn't the same. It was more present, closer. And when I stopped to check my footing on a dry creek crossing and looked east along the creek bed, I saw them. 3 Velhari. Adult size, not scouts, not the lean efficiency of the perimeter scouts, but something different, heavier, moving, with a deliberateness that read as voluntary escort rather than tracking. They were on the south bank of the dry creek, paralleling my route, perhaps 50 meters away. When I stopped, they stopped. When I crossed the creek and continued on my bearing, they continued on theirs. They were walking me home. I understood that in the moment I saw them, and the understanding sat in my chest with the same weight and warmth as the cub had on the sleeping pad, which is the best comparison I have. I walked the remaining 40 kilometers, with 3 Velhari adults paralleling my route on the south. They didn't close the distance, they didn't signal. They just walked, and when I walked, they walked. And the plateau was very clear and very quiet, and the garrison escarpment was visible for the last 20 kilometers, growing slowly larger against the sky. At the base of the escarpment switchbacks, they stopped. I stopped too, turned and looked at them across the 50 meters. They looked back. I couldn't read the expression. I am not, as I've said, trained in Velhari behavioral indicators. But there was something in the 3 of them stopped on the plateau with their manes clear against the thick amber scrub that did not feel like a threat and did not feel like a farewell. It felt like the end of something that had been understood between us from the moment we started walking. I raised my hand. It's a human gesture, and they wouldn't have read it the way I intended it, but it was what I had. I turned and walked up the switchbacks. I was met at the garrison gate by the duty officer, who asked where the crate was, and I said I'd left it in the Barrens. And she looked at me in a way that suggested she was going to have questions later. And I said I'd answer them when I was debriefed, and she let me through. Vian found me in the mess hall within the hour. He had the look of a man whose initiative has not proceeded according to plan. Not defeated, Vian was not the kind of officer who showed defeat, but compressed, like something had reduced the available space between his ambitions and his current situation, and he was in the process of deciding how to manage it. He sat down across from me. He said that he had been monitoring the transit through the garrison surveillance equipment, including the long-range drone relays that covered the plateau, and that he wanted my assessment of the contact at the canyon rim. I said that the contact had gone well. He said that he was aware it had gone well, and that this was in fact the problem because the Velhari territorial advisors, who had been watching the same relay feeds, had informed him that what had happened at the canyon rim constituted a category of interaction in Velhari protocol that they described with a term that translated, in his briefing, as named relation status, and that this status, if correctly interpreted, meant that the garrison to Velhari territorial negotiations he had been conducting for the previous 6 months had effectively been superseded because the Velhari had now, through the protocol enacted at the canyon rim, designated a specific liaison. He said that the designated liaison was me. I drank my water. He said that the Velhari had, through their territorial advisory channel, communicated, and he used the advisor's translation here, reading from a data pad, with a flatness that suggested that he had rehearsed it, that they would receive the garrison's diplomatic communications through Sergeant Orvath, and that Sergeant Orvath would be expected at the canyon boundary within the month for what was described as the formal establishment of terms, and that this designation was, in the Velhari's own framing, non-negotiable in the sense that the Velhari do not negotiate the categories of recognition they have already enacted. Vihan set the data pad down. He said, "I want you to understand the operational complexity this creates." I said, "I understand it." He said, "Survey protocol I've been building for the past 6 months requires a different kind of access arrangement than what this designation implies." I said, "I understand that too." He looked at me for a moment. He was a man who was used to the specific leverage of being the person who signs transfer papers for assignments the recipients cannot refuse, and he was working out, in real time, what it meant to not have that particular leverage in this particular situation. I said, "With respect, Commander, the Velhari don't recognize your survey protocol, and they haven't for the 6 months you've been running it. What they've recognized is a specific individual, through a specific interaction, in a specific category they've defined. Your options are to use that recognition or to not use it. There isn't a third option that gets you the access you want without going through what just happened on the plateau." I didn't say it unkindly. I am, as I said, not a man who raises his voice. Said it in the same tone I'd used to the cup through the ventilation panel suma on the first morning, which is to say, "This is how things are. Here is the information you need. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Vian looked at the data pad. He looked at the mess hall around us. He looked at me. He said, You understand that this assignment will require an indefinite extension of your posting here, I said. I understand, he said, and you're prepared to accept that. I thought about the plateau and the cold stars, and the weight of the cub against my ribs on the sleeping pad, and the canyon in the midday light, and the sound from the canyon walls that the advisors had called a condition rather than a call, and what it had felt like to hear it stop. I said, yes. Vian nodded once, the nod of a man filing something under completed transactions, and stood up and left. I finished my water, and sat for a while in the mess hall, which was warm and loud with garrison routine, and I thought about what I'd said, and whether I meant it. I did. I reported to the cultural advisors the next morning, and told them I was going to need to learn Velhari. Not functional Velhari, not just enough to manage basic diplomatic exchanges, real Velhari. The sonic registers, and the frequency ranges, and the particular vocabulary of the recognition categories. Because those were what mattered, and I had been navigating by instinct and terrain sense and a cub's choice of sleeping position for long enough, and it was time to do it correctly. The advisors stared at me. The senior one, a small methodical woman named Instructor Vale, who had been studying Velhari vocalization patterns for 30 years, and had, in my observation, essentially given up hope of anyone at the garrison caring about them, stared at me the longest. She said, "No one here has ever asked us to teach Velhari before." I said, "I know," she said. "It's the full register takes years. Subsonic component alone," I said. "I'm going to be here for a while." Instructor Vale looked at me. Then she looked at the senior advisor beside her, who looked back at her with the expression of two people who have been waiting for this conversation for longer than they've been willing to admit. She said, "Come back after morning rotation. We'll start with the tonal foundations." I came back after morning rotation. We started with the tonal foundations. 3 weeks later, I was standing at the plateau rim again with better equipment, better preparation, and a basic working vocabulary that Vale said was insufficient but functional. The 3 escort Velhari were already there when I arrived, which suggested they'd been watching the garrison long enough to know my departure time. I took this as a reasonable kind of compliment, and started down toward the canyon. The cub was waiting at the throat, bigger, in 3 weeks, than I'd expected. The iridescent scales had started to deepen toward the amber of adults, and it had grown perhaps 2 hands' worth in the shoulder, and it would be a different and larger animal in a year. It was sitting on the canyon path exactly where it had been when I'd last seen it, and when I came down the path, it stood up and made the rasping high note sound twice, sharp and close. And I said in the tonal foundation of Velhari, that was the closest equivalent to, "I hear you, here." And it stepped forward and pressed its head against my left knee with a weight and purpose that knocked me back a step. My hand on its neck, on the warm amber scales, and held still. From the den opening above and to the left, the Queen's subsonic vocalization came down through the canyon rock and up through the stone under my feet, and I felt it in my sternum before I heard it, the way I always did and probably always would, and I understood enough by then to know it was not the sound from the plateau microphones. Not the condition. It was something else, something the advisors in 3 weeks of tonal foundations had been working me toward but hadn't quite gotten to yet. I stored it, and later that evening, back at garrison with Instructor Vale, I reproduced it as accurately as I could and asked her what it meant. Vale listened to my reproduction. She was professionally pained by my pronunciation, but that was consistent, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's not a word exactly, there isn't a precise standard equivalent. The closest would be the name that a pack uses for the person who brought something back that was thought to be lost." I sat with that for a while. Then I asked her how you say thank you. She said, "The Velhari don't have a thank you. They have a concept that translates approximately as acknowledged, and I will remember this," I said. "That's better, actually," she said. "Yes. I've always thought so." I went back to the canyon the following week, and the week after that, and eventually they stopped being visits and became something else. Something that didn't have a name in garrison administrative vocabulary, but that Instructor Vale, reviewing my notes 6 months in, described with a Velhari term I was by then able to hear correctly. She said it meant one who has been placed inside the circle. I wrote it in my notes, I asked her how to pronounce it correctly. She told me it took time. I said, I've got time, and I did. I had the posting, and the plateau, and the cold stars over the Barrens at night, and a cub that was getting bigger every month, and a queen who lowered her head when I arrived, and a canyon that was slowly, in the way canyons teach things, slowly and with patience and through repetition, becoming familiar. Vian submitted the survey protocol modification request 3 months later. It was rejected. I heard about it from the duty officer, heard about it from the communications desk, and by the time it reached me, it was just a fact and not a drama. The kind of thing that resolves, quietly, when the ground conditions have already resolved it. Vian was reassigned to Sector 11 4 months after that, which was not a punitive posting exactly, but was a posting with less plateau and no canyon, and considerably less opportunity to build what he would called a territorial calibration initiative. I stayed. That was. It's been long enough now that I don't count in months anymore, just in seasons, which is a Velhari way of organizing time that I picked up from instructor Viel and found more accurate for this kind of work. Several seasons. Long enough that the cub is not quite a cub anymore and has started taking its place on the South Approach escort is a thing it does. With a seriousness that would be funny if the creature doing it were not the size of a large vehicle. Long enough that I can hear the difference, now, between the subsonic registers, the ones that mean the approach is acknowledged and the ones that mean the approach is welcome, and the one that Vale told me on a cold evening in the garrison briefing room with the plateau dark outside means the name the pack uses for the person who brought something back. I can say it back now. Not well. Vale says my tonal accuracy is improving and my subsonic register is probably permanently compromised by my species' acoustic limitations, that it's acceptable. That the Queen accepts it. The advisors have started using the word relationship in their reports. They do not do lightly. I use a shorter word. The canyon is 3 days from the garrison, and the walk is the same walk it always was. Pale ground, amber scrub, cold stars at night, the specific quality of light on the plateau at midday that makes distances deceptive. The crate is still somewhere in the Barrens, which I know because I've walked past it twice and not picked it up. It's weather-worn now, the ventilation panels half buried in drift. I leave it where it is. I don't need it anymore, and neither does anyone else. And the Barrens are patient with the things left in them. The canyon is still 3 days, and always worth it. I know that because I've made the walk enough times now to know the answer before I ask the question, which is the Velhari definition of trust, or the closest one instructor Vale has been able to give me, and I've decided to take it. Cub chose me on the plateau rim, and the Queen remembered it, and the pack put me inside their circle, and that is the whole of it. That is entirely enough.